Good afternoon and welcome to Lunching with Books, and thank you for coming out. And I'm sorry our rival fans didn't get here today, but they will have really missed a treat. Our reviewer today is Al Povall, and he has written 2 books. The book he'll be talking about both, I imagine, but the book featured in today is really A Time Remembered, and it's an oral history about the years at Ole Miss from 1945 to 1970, and it's a remarkable companion to a tapestry of red and blue. And if you went to Ole Miss, and even if you did not go to Ole Miss, I think you will find these stories to be truly interesting. I bought the book and I started reading about my son's father-in-law over here and about Piggy, and and I was fascinated, but I bought it to give away, so I had to give it away, so I'm going to get another one to read about the other characters in the book. Just a little bit about Al Povall. He is a native Mississippian. He holds both a BA and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Mississippi, as well as an LLM from the Yale Law School. He was a naval officer, and he served 2 combat tours in Vietnam, and he and his wife Janet now live in Oxford. Al is the author of The Time of Eddie Noel, which was a nominee for the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters for Best Nonfiction Award in 2011. And anyway, he has now written 2 other books, and we are so delighted to have him here, and he's going to tell us about these books. Thank you, Al.
Well, hello, Tupelo. Good to be back over here. Have a lot of friends, some great friends who are here today. And my mother lived over here for a number of years. Betty Staub. She was married to Joe Staub. Loved it here. Had a lot of great friends. We lost Mama a couple of years ago at the age of 100. And I'm convinced if she hadn't fallen, she'd be here today. She was an amazing lady. So let me tell you a little bit about these books and how they came to be. There are actually 2 of them. The first one is A Tapestry of Red and Blue, and the second one is A Time Remembered. And so it's really a 2-volume set. They are oral histories. And people ask, well, how did you come to do these other than you are a die-hard Ole Miss fan? And the answer to that is that when I was living in Jackson, I had a client, a man named Jim Bennett. And he used to tell me about coming back to Ole Miss right after World War II and living in Vet Village and all those stories and how thin the walls were and what the heating system was like or not like. They almost didn't have one, and no hot water and all that. So I thought, this is really too valuable to allow just to disappear. And if I ever get a chance, I'm going to write something about that. Well, about the same time, 2 books came out that gave me the idea for a vehicle to use to do these. One was written by a guy named Studs Terkel, and it was The Good War. It was about World War II, and it was an oral history. And the other one was written by an economist named Stern, and it was called The Glory of Their Times. And it is absolutely the best baseball book I've ever read. It's the best ever written. So if you like baseball, get a chance. It's about all of the players in the old era from about 1890 to about 1920. So that's how this came to be. Now, there are some people, excuse me, in this room who contributed to the books, and I'm going to read a little bit from 3 of them, but let me recognize them. Glenn Davidson was and is my fraternity brother, and we were in the same pledge class. Howard Hines is not in the book, but he was in my room. We were roommates at the Pike House, and I think it's scarred him forever. Howard, I apologize. And Sandy Sams I've known forever. Sandy was a Phi Delta Theta at Ole Miss, and I think my brother-in-law, Will Lewis, was his big brother, if I recall that right.
He was a dear friend.
Dear friend, okay. And Sandy is in the book, and then Peggy Caldwell is in both books. And so I'll do a little reading from Peggy today. So I'm going to just talk, and I'll read some, and then we'll open it up, and if anybody has any questions or comments always scare me, but we'll do them anyway. Okay, the book actually starts in 1940. I did a little prelude. 3 people, Marilyn Howell, she's now here, Marilyn Howell Bullion, William Winter, and Lila Lee Nasa McWright. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. Marilyn Howell was from Lafayette County, went to Ole Miss, lived at home, and her, it's a wonderful interview. It's a lot. It's about Ole Miss during the war years. But the most interesting thing about Marilyn is she was the first and only female president of the Associated Student Body elected in 1943. And until about 10 years ago, and I think we've had 2 since since then. But she held that distinction for a long time. She is a great lady, lives out east of town, and she says in her interview, and I'll paraphrase, that when she ran, she beat a guy named Vernon Jones. She said, but if William Winter hadn't left, he would have beat her like a drum, that he was so popular. Now, one other from that era, Lila Lee Nasa McWright came from Vicksburg. She was Lila Lee Nasa, and she's Lebanese. And she was a wonderful interview. She died maybe a year ago and was still in the Grove for every football game. An absolutely lovely lady and a lovely interview. And Lila held 3 distinctions at Ole Miss. She was most beautiful. She was a cheerleader for 3 years and head cheerleader. And she was Miss Ole Miss. And she's the only Miss Ole Miss to ever be crowned who was married at the time she was crowned. She had gotten married between her election and her crowning, and Dean Heffley, who was a holy terror, they say, told her she was not going to let her be crowned. But the students wouldn't have it, and there was so much pressure that the chancellor prevailed on Ms. Heffley, Dean Heffley, to let her be crowned. And she said something that I thought was really poignant. I want to read it. She said, I asked her about Rush. She was not in a sorority. And she said, Lebanese girls didn't go through Rush. There was probably discrimination against Lebanese girls, Jewish girls, and I guess Italian girls. Greek girls got into Phi Mu. So when I went to Ole Miss, I didn't expect to be Rush. It had been that way all my life, and it didn't bother me. It was just a fact of life. And I read that and it makes me sad, but then I think, boy, did she show them. Somebody would have really been lucky to have had Lila Lee as a member. Has anyone ever heard the name Winfield Dunn? Tennessee, governor of Tennessee. Well, he's an Ole Miss guy, and he was there from 1947 to 1950. And he married a girl named Betty Pritchard, who was a beauty, and they've been married a long time. They live out from Nashville. And I asked Governor Dunn what he got out of Ole Miss, and he said, Ole Miss prepared me very well for subsequent life. It helped round me out as a man. Courtesy was a part of the environment there, and I learned to get along with people. I had a good education in banking and finance, and I learned a great deal from my social experiences. Interesting, with that background, he had thought he would be a lawyer, but he served in the military and got out, and then he decided to go to dental school and was a dentist in Memphis, and was elected a city councilman, I believe, in Memphis, and worked on up the ladder, eventually serving as governor of Tennessee, I think from 1971 to 1975. Now, Piggy is here, and he was a great interview. And he talked about a couple of guys. When I went, and Glenn went, and Howard went, in the late 50s, early 60s, we were hearing all these stories about two guys, one named V.P. Ferguson, and the other one named Mose Allison. Well, now, Mose Allison went on to become a great jazz performer and singer, and had several albums. And when I was in the service, I was stationed in California, and everybody knew him out there. He was not really that well known in Mississippi. But we heard all these stories, and Piggy talks about him, and he says that V.P. Ferguson's daddy was a professor at MSCW, and V.P., Piggy was a lifeguard over at the swimming pool. And so one day, V.P. Ferguson came to the pool, and he had on his wife's two-piece bathing suit.
Just the bottom.
Just the bottom. And he said it was a kind of a satin-looking thing. And the next day, the guy, I think his name was Al Boisier, is that right? He called or came to see Piggy, and he said, tell him you can't wear that. And so VP came back the next day in that outfit, and Piggy told him he has to change, so he went and changed. He asked him why he was doing it. He said, I'm getting a suntan. I don't know. So he went back and came back in a regular bathing suit. Mose and VP roomed together. We had never heard of drugs back then, but someone swore that if you went in that room, it would smell like a pot house because they had that marijuana going. So they were way ahead of their time. And the other thing Peggy talked about was Sadie Hawkins Day. Y'all remember that, some of you? That was a, huh?
Little Abner.
Yeah, and that's, Peggy was Little Abner, is that right? And Mary Frances Waring was Daisy May. And he said that he and Roland Dale were friends, about the same size, and wore the same size suit. So he'd ask, are you going to wear the blue suit this weekend? I'd say no, so he'd wear the blue suit. I'd ask him if he was going to wear the blue suede shoes, and he'd say no, and that's what we had to do. We got along the best we could. A guy named Henry Paris. Any of you remember Henry? Henry was my hometown, Lexington, a Jewish guy, and Henry was a cheerleader 3 years, and he was a non-football player. And in those days, and in my day, Colonel Rebel was always a football player. But Henry ran against a football player and won. So it was really very unusual, and he was also Hall of Fame. But and I asked, he was a member of the Jewish fraternity there, and I asked him, and he said, I didn't participate in Rush except to go to the Jewish fraternity. Of course, they offered me a beer and a bid, and I accepted both, and that was it. I was hurt a little, but my dad had prepared me. It was a shock, but it was hurtful. I said, I had several people tell me, I wish we could have had you over, and I appreciate it. But I will say this, after Rush Week, never again did I detect any type of prejudice whatsoever. I ran in 4 elections, and I never lost, cheerleader 3 years and Colonel Rebel. I beat Ken Farragut, who was captain of the team. So like I say, after that, there was no prejudice, none. Parm Williams, huh?
He's still living in Oxford.
Yeah, he's in Oxford.
He sees other quite a bit.
Yeah, he's a great guy and really a great Mississippian, and lived in Indianola. There was a company over there called the Lewis Grocery Company. It originated in Lexington and eventually became Sunflower Food Stores, but they sold that number of years ago. Parm Williams, some of you will remember him. I know Glenn and Sandy and I really do. He was a law professor at Ole Miss Law School and eventually became dean, and he was tough. Let me tell you, he was tough in class. But I asked Parm how he happened to come to Ole Miss. I'm going to paraphrase. But he said he was actually going to state. But he had a friend who was at state, and he asked him, well, how is it up there? And the friend had just finished his freshman year. And he said, well, I tell you, it's tough. Well, why? And he said, well, I lived in Old Main. And he said, down in the basement, none of the toilets had seats on them. So the upperclassmen would grab a freshman or grab some freshmen in the morning and make them go down and sit on the toilets and warm them up for the upperclassmen. And he said, when I heard that, y'all excuse me, chilling tale, I didn't want to be the butt of a cruel Mississippi State joke. So he came to Ole Miss. He was Hall of Fame also. Parm is now a great guy since he's retired from the law business. He's been dean, actually, of 3 schools. He's written a book. He's really an outstanding person. And he was a good teacher at law school. Okay. Who we got here? Hardy Stennis. Anybody ever heard of Hardy? Hardy went to law school. He was at Ole Miss 3 different times. And this is the part when he was an undergraduate. And he talks about fraternity initiation. He was a Sigma Nu. And he said that, now let me find it here. He said, I made my grades and got initiated into Sigma Nu. Initiation, listen to this, I'm sworn not to tell another soul, but then he tells it. I thought it was the silliest damn thing that ever happened to me. They took us in there and they made us all strip down to our shorts. Then they put us in the living room and they started all this foreign talk and everything and all this swearing and showed us what the handshake was. They said, if you ever tell anybody these secrets, it will be terrible for you, so you better not tell. Then they took you down one by one to be formally initiated, and they marched you up front and made you kneel down. They took a sword like you were being knighted, and it was all I could do to keep from laughing. They then ran us through a line where they whipped us with their belts. We wore jockey shorts, and they took an egg and pulled your breeches out and dropped the egg in there and made you run through the line, at which time they whipped you with a board and busted the egg. I mean, that's the way it was back in the early 50s. And he says a lot more about initiation that I won't go into. Will Lewis, my brother-in-law, talks about a guy named Jack Cheatham, and I bet Sandy remembers Jack. Jack was a guy from Florida who came up to Ole Miss, and he was a fraternity brother of Sandy's and Will's. And Will was a native of Oxford, father and family owned J.E. Nelson Company. and Will does today. And Will, Jack wanted to meet William Faulkner. And Will said, I had English majors all the time asking me to introduce them to Mr. Faulkner, and I wouldn't do it. Well, Jack was over at my house having dinner. He said his mother fed people all the time. And Jack asked Will's father if he would do it. And he said, of course. So he went over and he called and he said, Bill, I've got a young man here who wants to meet you. His name is Jack Cheatham. Well, send him over, Mr. Faulkner said. So Jack went over there. And it's really an amazing story. They became fast friends. And Jack took a little hibachi over there, and they would cook out, and they would have drinks, and Estelle would be around, and he went sailing with him out on Sardis. And when Mr. Faulkner died, a lot of things that Jack had over at the Faulkner house, including the hibachi, went to the University of Virginia and are in that museum up there. And Jack lives up there, and they have tried many times to get Jack to come down here to the Faulkner Conference or to go to Virginia. But he will, I really admire him for that. He has never capitalized on that, and he turns them down every time. John Bones Castle. Bones Castle. Bones had a twin brother named Greaser. Bones and Greaser. When I first heard it, I thought there was one person named Bones and Greaser because they always went together. Bones and Greaser were Sigma News, and Bones, there are two stories that I want to relate to you in here. One of them relates to Elvis Presley, and he said, they went out to a concert, this was before Elvis hit it big, at Randolph, Mississippi, which I didn't know even existed, but it's out from Oxford. And so after the concert, they went up and met Elvis, and Bones said, I was looking at Elvis, and he said, I've always wanted to play down at Ole Miss College. And I'm thinking, he doesn't even know the name of the school. So I said, we want you to play. And he says, well, I want to do it, but I've got to go to New York to be on a show called The Dorsey Brothers. And this is going to be my first time to be on television. And then I'm going to get my agent to get in touch with you. And I'm going to come down there and put on a show for you at Ole Miss College. So he went to The Dorsey Brothers, and the rest is history. From there, he went on to Steve Allen and then to Ed Sullivan, and that was the end of Ole Miss College. And then the other one, he said they had a guy named Harold Jenkins who played at the Sigma Nu House at parties for $100 a shot. And said that Harold Jenkins and his band were going to Texas, going through Arkansas, and they heard Elvis. And Harold said to his band, said, I can sing as good as Elvis. He said, I don't know why I'm not doing that well. And one of the band members said, well, the problem is your name, Harold Jenkins. You are never going to hit it big with the name of Harold Jenkins. Change your name. And so Harold looked over at a road sign, and it said, you're now leaving Conway, Arkansas. And he looked up at the next sign, and it said Twitty, Texas, 20 miles. And he took the name Conway Twitty. And the rest is history. And that's, Bones told me that story. Let's see. I asked Sandy Sams what impact or what he felt about his time at Ole Miss, and I thought he summed it up so well. He said, my time at Ole Miss was some of the best days of my life. I loved Ole Miss then, and I continue to love Ole Miss now. Ole Miss helped me get through and get an education, so I try to give back. I think most folks who went there try to do that to give some thanks for the support we got as students. Frank Everett's statement about Ole Miss is so true. You never leave Ole Miss. It is a part of you always. And I think that's so true for all of us who went there. Now, a fraternity brother of mine named Hubert McAlexander told the story of the Pike Ghost. And I want to relate that to you and then tell you a little bit about Hubert and some other people who were there with him. Right after the World War II, the story goes, a young man was in his room studying, and someone knocked on the door, came in, he said, I was a Pike here, talked to him for a while, and he said, my name is Jimmy Van Deventer, I was here before the war, and I just wanted to come back and look around, blah, 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 and they talked, and then he left. And so someone came in, the next morning he was at breakfast, and he said, an alumnus came by last night and I met him and talked to him. He said, someone said, what's his name? And he said, Jimmy Van Deventer. And the guy looked at him kind of funny and said, come on over here and look at this composite with me. And they went over and looked. And he said, yeah, that's him, Jimmy Van Deventer, James Van Deventer. And the guy said, well, it couldn't have been. He was killed in World War II. So that's the story. That's the story of the Pike Ghost. We all heard that as we came along. And there's a picture of James Van Deventer. He was editor of the Annual, and apparently a great guy, and there's a picture of him in the book. But people here or in the fraternity, we overlap with Hubert, but Hubert talks about some of the people who were in the fraternity. And I'll say this about Hubert. He was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize on one of his books on Peter Taylor. His roommate was a guy named Tom McCraw, who went on to be a professor at Harvard, who won a Pulitzer Prize. And I would wager that those two roommates are the only roommates ever to be nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Now, the other guys who were in there were Brad Dye, who was lieutenant governor, I think, 3 times of Mississippi, Thad Cochran, a United States senator, and Glenn Davidson, who is a federal judge and of whom we are all so proud. And Glenn, I talked to Glenn, did a great interview, and I ought to get him to tell it. So if he will, it's in the aftermath of the Meredith riot. Are you up to it, or you want me to?
I think I can remember.
Come on up.
I'll do the best I can.
He, in the aftermath of the Meredith riot, they had locked down the campus.
Yeah.
And Glenn was in law school and living in Huddleston.
Level Hall, right across.
Take it away, Glenn.
Right across from the cafeteria. And it was the morning after the Meredith riots. And I just thought Monday morning, all that started on Sunday afternoon in September after that Kentucky game. And you stop me with time, Al. We don't have a limited time. Well, I just, the night before, we could, listen to the radio, heard President Kennedy speaking, and you could look out the room and down the hill and all this. You could actually hear gunfire and tear gas and everything going on. But I thought the next morning, law school, they'd just start Monday morning, had a 8 o'clock class. So I started walking down the hill to law school, and I got down Sandy about even with the Lyceum, the mathematics building was across the street there. And the tear gas was so intense that you couldn't go any further. So I went in this classroom building, and the worst thing in the world, tried to wash my eyes. And they said, well, water makes tear gas just that much worse. So I knew I had to go back to my room. I knew, and of course, people told me, well, there's no way you're going to have classes here at Ole Miss today or this week probably. But anyway, I went back to my room, and I was just there, and there was some of that dormitory was all law students, all law students, and they began to come back and said, if you leave here, they've got roadblocks everywhere, and they're checking them, and if you've got a gun, they'll take you to the stockade and lock you up. They had fences over there by the football field. Well, doggone it, I was a duck hunter, and I had a shotgun, and it was out in my car, so I didn't dare leave that campus with that gun in my car. So I went back in the dorm, sat there a few minutes, and the guys come in and said, well, they've started searching dormitories, and they're coming up the hill. I had taken the gun out of my car and put it in the dormitory closet, thinking I might go home at some point. But anyway, they started searching all the rooms, and I had that shotgun, so I didn't know what to do. But I went down to the Lyceum, and man, there was tear gas, just so thick. And I was looking for, and the 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne was already there on campus, and I started looking for the highest ranking Army person I could find, and I did. I found a captain, and I said, Captain, I've got a shotgun up in my room, and I don't want it. I want some of you people to have it. And he said, well, I don't know what to do. And he took me, he said, we'll have to go in the building here and talk with the gentleman in there. So he directed me. I followed him into the Lyceum, and there were Deputy United States Marshals literally sitting on the floor wounded, bleeding, and they were trying to do first aid, tape them up. He took me on down the hall, and I just it popped in my mind. I said, Captain, am I under arrest? He said, well, I don't know. We'll have to talk to the gentleman in here. And so we went in one of the offices there in the Lyceum, and sure enough, there sitting behind the desk was James McShane, who was the Chief United States Marshal for the entire nation. And I had seen him on television a day or two before, and I knew who it was. And he just said, Captain said, what's the problem? And he said, well, this young man has a shotgun, and he doesn't want it. He wants some of us to have it. And McShane said, I wish there were 200 or 300 more like him. And he said, Captain, go take him up and get his shotgun. So he walked up the hill with me and took my shotgun, and he picked it up, and it was a pump gun. I said, nope, pump it and smell it. You can tell that gun hadn't been shot in a week or 2 weeks. And so he did, and he gave me a receipt. And that was the end of my shotgun. But then that was in September. The next May, I got a postcard, and they said, your gun's at the ROTC building. You can pick it up. And they inspected every firearm that they confiscated. They sent to the FBI laboratory and tested it to see if it had been recently fired. And I'm sure some people got in trouble. Okay.
Thank you, Glenn. How about a round of applause? Isn't that a great story? Okay, Curtis Wilkie. Anybody heard of him? If you know him now and you see this picture of him, I won't hold it up, it's so small. It's quite a shock. But he's bearded now, and he's got a lot of hair and silver, and someone introduced him not long ago at a thing I went to as one of Mississippi's 2 greatest living journalists. He had a fabulous career, distinguished career as a journalist, the Boston Globe. And he has some just amazing stories in here. Some of them I had to pry out of him things that he was doing at the time. He was really a wild guy. But he talks about a guy named Millard P. Burt, an African American. And he says of Millard, he was the SA houseboy and a man for all seasons, a jack of all trades. He was a houseboy, bootlegger, pimp, musician, and he had his own band. But the bootlegger was the most important aspect of his job. He kept all the liquid goods in the mop closet on the second floor of the SAE house. He also kept quart bottles of beer iced down in the sink of the mop closet, where he ordinarily would have been bringing our mops if he had mopped. The last semester I was over there, Jay Schwab and I had the corner room, and he said we kept it under our bed. We kept the hard liquor under our bed. We, as a exchange for keeping the hard liquor, he could go into the mop closet and help myself to a quart of beer anytime I wanted to. Well, so I thought, gosh, that's so interesting. Millard P. Burt, and I went out and I interviewed him, and he's just amazing. And he talked about they had a bus, the SAEs did, and he would drive them on the bus out to parties. They would out these cabins in the country, and so he took them out to this old house, and they were having a party. And he said, so anyway, we were out at this old empty house in the country, and R.P. Holmes started jumping up and down, and then everybody started jumping up and down, and they broke the floor in. And after that, they started burning it, and they burned it down. And there's more. I mean, it's some amazing stuff. Kiamis. Kiamis was an absolute icon and an institution in Oxford and at Ole Miss for many years. I interviewed Kay Kiami, who was Alex Kiami's, the founder of the restaurant, and himself just an institution in Oxford. Mr. Kiami would cash a check. You could write it on the back of a napkin. You could write Holmes County Bank, Lexington, Mississippi, $5, and he'd cash it. He didn't care. But he kept up with it, and if your check bounced, he'd be at your room about a day later to collect on it. But Kay was a wonderful interview, and she told about how her parents emigrated to United States and went to Clarksdale and then to Batesville, and then Mr. Kiami borrowed money from Bob Dunlap in Batesville, who's a great Ole Miss fan, has a large tire business, and opened in Oxford in, I think, 1950, year of the Maryland game, 52. And Vietnam was going on, and a group of Ole Miss boys joined the Army Reserve unit down in Greenwood to get out of the draft. Well, I think there was one unit in Mississippi that got called up, and that was it. And there were about 12 or 15 of them in there, and they all went to Vietnam. And there's a copy in here of a long scroll-like document that says, Dear Mr. Kiami, it's dated October the 9th, 1968. Some old friends of yours are here together in Phu Ba, South Vietnam, and we decided that we would like to order 10 bowls of chili, 4 cheese dog, and 1 chili dog with just mustard. I guess your 25-cent delivery charge still stands. We are up near the DMZ. And then they go on to talk about what they're doing, and they were activated in May. We all descend to send you a greeting and wish we were back to be good customers and give everyone our greeting there and keep the rebels fired up. And there's a picture of them in here. It's really an amazing story. And there's a lot about that. But the Kiami story is amazing too. There was an African American lady named May Helen who cooked the chili, and they said she never washed the pot. She just kept dumping stuff into it, and it just got greasier and greasier. And they had chili dogs and chili burgers and chili any way you wanted it. And all of us went out there, and guys would go out. Girls had to be in on weekends, I think, maybe midnight. Is that about right? After a party, something, maybe not that late. And so the guys would all go out to Kiami's afterwards, and they said it was the best prevention for a hangover there was. A Kiami's chili dog would just take care of everything. I'm going to move on to wrap this up, but one of our fraternity brothers was a guy named Tommy Couch. He was from the Tri-Cities up in Alabama. I think he was from Muscle Shoals, but one of them. And Tommy came down to Oxford, and there were a lot of musicians in that area up there. And one of the bands contacted him and asked him if he would book them down at Ole Miss. And they said, we'll pay you 10% of our fee. So he thought, well, that's a really good idea. And so he started doing it. And he went on and got in, and he had another, excuse me, fraternity brother named Wolf Stevenson. And the two of them began doing this, and they created quite a little business in college. But the important thing is that Tommy booked a band that had never come to Ole Miss, and the lead singer was a guy named Percy Sledge. And Percy went on to great fame, and when I heard him in Oxford at Ford Center, he said, I really started my career at the Pike House at Ole Miss. That was the first time he'd ever played, and he got a lot of publicity. And Tommy went on to form Malaco Records down in Jackson, which was a huge recording venue for a lot of great artists, a lot of rhythm and blues people, and a great success, and still, in fact, owns it. There was a guy named Paul Parrish. I think, Luann, do you remember? No? He was there, I think, maybe 64 to 68. And Paul was from Port Gibson, and he didn't go out for Rush. He was an independent, a dorm manager, and above everything else, he was smart as he could be. And he was a Rhodes Scholar with Bill Clinton, and rode a ship over to England to be the Rhodes Scholar, and he got to know Bill Clinton very well. But Paul is in San Francisco, and he writes a column for the San Francisco, is it the Chronicle, I believe that's the newspaper there, on dancing, ballet, and all that. And he was a wonderful interview, and had a lot to say about a lot of different things, including managing my sister Amanda's campaign for Secretary of the Student Body, which she won. But what he said is, let me find him. I asked him, in the late 60s, did marijuana and the anti-war and all that come in there? And he said, I tried some marijuana and really nothing happened. I saw almost nothing of the drug culture at Ole Miss. The person who gave it to me not only did not use it in any regular way. At Ole Miss, the culture was drinking and dancing. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life as a dancer. I'm still proud to have gone to a university where fraternity parties would have James Brown to play. And James Brown, I'm sure some of you have heard about. I'm going to do one more, maybe two. Reuben Anderson, Glenn and I and Sandy, of course, know who Reuben is. Reuben was the first African-American student in the law school, and he was the only one that year. And I talked to him, and again, a wonderful interview, and he said that he basically was alone and that he almost stopped several times, but Josh Morris, who was the dean, and several other professors talked him out of it. And he said, I was at Ole Miss when Robert Kennedy came. It was organized by the Democrats on campus. I went to the event and recorded his presentation. Edward Ellington was behind that, and he goes on to say, Trent Lott and I were in the same class. The first time he ever recognized who I was when I was on the Mississippi Supreme Court. If I were in the room, he would sit as far away from me as he could, and that's generally how it was with everybody. If I was in the room, I was isolated. Nobody sat next to me unless they were seat assignments. And then he went on to say, however, there is no institution I love as much as Ole Miss. I just understand the times, and I just had to roll with the punches. When I got out of Ole Miss, I had so many advantages over other people. I didn't have to take the bar, and people recognized me as being as good a lawyer as anybody else was. So I look at the times, and I understand them. So I think that's really a poignant sort of statement. It's like Lila Nasser's statement about Rush. I just mentioned some others in the book. Paul Murrell, 52 to 56, was, I think they call it Chancellor of LSU, married to a Lexington girl. She was Nancy Williams. Dan Jordan, who was the curator for many, many years at Monticello, is in here, and his wife Lou is accomplished artist. Sidney Brower, who was the editor of the Mississippian at the time of the Meredith riot, was nominated for a Pulitzer while she was editor of the Mississippian, underwent a lot of harassment and votes to censure her by the Senate. Lives up in New Jersey now, was editor of a paper up there. She told me it got so bad that she had a date after a football game, and she went to the KA house, and the president of the KA house came down and told her to leave. They didn't want her in there. So anyway, that tells you. Jim Barksdale, he was president of Netscape, a really generous Mississippian, lives in Jackson now. Alan Perry, who was president of the State Board of Institutions of Higher Learning also. And so I'm just going to read one thing from my epilogue, which I wrote. I'm not going to give you all of it. But I talk about the campus and the beauty and things that, and I say maybe in heaven, just maybe, there's a corner, and it's called Ole Miss. And that, and I describe how it would look and how it would be in the fall, and football games, and Jake Gibbs and Bobby Crespino and Glenn Griffin and undefeated seasons. And I talk about the game at LSU that we lost on Cannon's Run, 73 and 59. And I say this time Jake Gibbs makes the tackle and we win the game and we are undisputed national champions. And I go on, I talk about the way the girls dressed and how pretty they were. And I talk about the grill and the bridge game that went on at the first table to the left, and the haze of cigarette smoke that hung over it all the time, and rock and roll music and dancing occasionally. And in the grill, students form friendships, establish relationships, ask for and make dates, hold hands, fall in love. I do not know whether such a place exists in heaven, but I do know this. For those of us who attended but never left Ole Miss and who make it to heaven, it will be our second time in paradise. I'll close on that. Thank you very much. Oh, questions, comments? Okay, you're out of here. Oh.
I was going to ask, what years were you at Ole Miss?
I was there in 59 to 63. Those were my undergraduate. And Glenn was in the same class. He graduated in 3 years, though, and then went on to law school his fourth year. And I will say this, in the 4 years I was there, we lost, I have to think, we lost to LSU. In my sophomore year, we lost to LSU. My junior year, we tied LSU. And my senior year, we won undefeated. So we lost 2 games and tied 1. I mean, it was a wonderful, we had Rhodes Scholars, Fulbright Scholars. One of my fraternity, our fraternity brothers, Bob Childress was a Rhodes Scholar, John Whitworth was a Fulbright. So it was really a golden era in the history of Ole Miss.
Keep waiting for the return now.
We've all been, haven't we? It has been a long wait. Anything else?
Miss America.
Oh, we did. We had back-to-back Miss Americas, 59 and 60. And Linda Mead, she says, I was never Linda Lee Mead, I was Linda Mead. But they picked that up when she was Miss America. They liked Linda Lee, Robert E. Lee, the South, and so they called her Linda Lee. She's a great interview, and she is still an absolutely gorgeous woman, just one of the prettiest women I've ever seen. Okay, you're on your own. Thank you.
There are books here that for sale and that people sign for you and personalized. See you next month.